Before we get started, I just want to say super big hello and thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you for sharing your time and your space with us today. We are deeply honored and grateful to have you here with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Rashmi to get it started and kind of go on from there. But we are Sub, and we are very excited to be with you today.
Thank you, Madhu, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Just can we get a virtual thumbs up if you can? Great. So as Madhu mentioned, we are South Asians Building Bridges, and our session today is titled, Where Are You From? No, Where Are You Really From? And today we're going to be focusing on recentering anti-racism work in South Asian identity formation. Isha, can you hit next slide, please? Thank you. Just before we get started, we wanted to just give everybody a quick rundown of the community guidelines for today. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but just maybe just the last one I'll kind of go over. I think most of these are pretty self-explanatory. As far as the last bullet point goes, just please be sure to be aware of your privilege and take your space accordingly, meaning just be watchful of what you say, but also this is a learning space, so let's all be patient with one another and educate to the best of our ability about things that might have been offensive to us or what have you. So let's just kind of be open with each other and engage with each other so that we can all be in this learning process together. As far as Zoom etiquette goes, please do mute yourself if you're not speaking. And if you do want to speak, please do raise your hand virtually on Zoom. And also please type your the word share into this chat box. That way we can kind of have a running tab of who raised their hand first, and we don't have any discrepancies with like who we're calling on and stuff. So those are just the community guidelines. And we are, as we kind of were doing this already in the chat, if you haven't done so already, please put your name and pronouns if you're so comfortable with that in the chat, and maybe 1 to 2 sentences about where you're from, how did you get here, and here can be literally anything, what brought you to the summit overall, what brought you to our session in particular. We just want to get to know you. And in the meantime, while those are rolling in the intro, I'm going to take a second to kind of just introduce who we are. As Madhu mentioned, we are South Asians Building Bridges, and we were formed in June of 2020, so right in the middle of the pandemic. We recognized the need in our South Asian community in Pittsburgh for facilitating more discussion around issues like race and equity and inclusion. And frankly, we just saw a lot of complacency around these topics and around these issues. And so a group of us came together and we decided to form this organization called South Asians Building Bridges to really facilitate more dialogue and critical consciousness around race, and particularly anti-Blackness in the South Asian community. And so we aim to do that by educating and doing a lot of community outreach, as well as institutional collaborations. Those are our big objectives that we have as an organization. At the end of this presentation, we will be putting our social media up on the screen. So please give us a follow, reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram, and we'd love to continue the conversation more and get to know you more. But that's a little about who we are. And again, feel free to like ask us more questions as we go on today, either in the chat or after the session is over on Instagram or Facebook.
All right, next slide. So hello, everyone. My name is Madhu. I use she, her pronouns. For our session today, just a quick overview. We want to be as transparent as possible as we use ours and your time. We will be initially starting with presenting some foundational theory and ideas and concepts that we have strongly drawn off of in our just general work as Sub and in the session specifically. We have 3 main themes that we are going to do with our popular media analysis, and 2 of those will lead to a small group, and then after our 3rd theme we will go into a large group discussion and then kind of do closing. And we just want to acknowledge that we have a lot that we want to say, we have a lot that we want to hear from all of you. So just being mindful of time on our end as well as your end as we are going through and all these things. So Isha, if you want to hit the next slide. So let me just dive right in to the body of our discussion today. To start our session, I want to introduce a couple quotes from Isabel Wilkerson's Cast: The Origin of Our Discontents. Her text played such a big part in how we framed and conceptualized our topic. So let me read, and they're on the screen as well. Let me read these 2 quotes out. The first one is caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. What people call racism could be seen as merely one manifestation of the degree to which we have internalized a larger American caste system. And then another one that we found really striking was caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It is the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. So those quotes are really big and they're heavy. And like Isabel Wilkerson in her work and in our text, for the purposes of our session and discussion, we're thinking about caste broadly to extend beyond the traditional view of caste as being rooted in the Indian caste system, but as a way to think of any hierarchical system of perceived and experienced worth that many things are projected onto. For example, thinking about race and racism in the US as operating within a spectrum as we've kind of visually depicted on our screen here. In the spectrum where white people are given privileges and perceived as a higher caste and Black people are perceived as a bottom caste, and filing everyone else in as such as South Asians into that spectrum and that system accordingly. In order to think about caste in this broad way, we do have to acknowledge the social construction of various systems that it can embody, such as gender, race, class, beauty standards, etc., and how all of these things work to file into this larger caste system. So in thinking, like Isabel Wilkerson writes in chapter 6, she says race is not synonymous with caste, but it is a social construct that has been projected onto caste systems that coexist and reinforce each other in the same culture. So thinking about how caste is the bones, but race is the skin. When we think about racism in this larger caste system in the United States, we can think about how we're thinking about the hierarchical categorization of people historically with each immigrant group to come over after or even during Native colonization, starting from the poor white people as indentured servants to Black people in slavery, and further evolving with each group that came over, such as the Japanese workers or the South Asian laborers. We see that each group was there to outsource labor to serve one of the higher groups within that spectrum. Each instance of moving up in this system is predicated on stepping on the backs of the people categorized below them. And this works to preserve the system with each new social structure, with each new social group. As more points get added, it just feels like more points are added into this pre-existing system. And I think this image of this kind of pyramid with this various groups of people depicts that idea really well. In our session and beyond, we invite you to think about how we can use this idea and reimagine our identities as we deconstruct and fracture this idea of a spectrum. When we don't use this spectrum to prescribe meaning to our existence and identity, we can engage in identity formation processes that are liberating for all. Now, of course, this is very idealistic, and this is not an easy process or a short-term process, as this caste system is so deeply ingrained systemically, politically, and institutionally. People without even explicitly meaning to could be castists and participating in this caste system, meaning that they're invested in keeping the hierarchy as it is, or are content to do nothing to really change it or shake it up. However, by critically engaging with where we are and how we play in and how we fit in to this larger caste system that lots of things are projected onto, for example, race, gender, all those things that I mentioned earlier, we can begin to reframe our own identities to center anti-racism and work to destabilize this deeply embedded caste system. That was a lot. And so I'm going to pass it over to Rashmi to kind of reframe it in another way, just to get the ball rolling and thinking about this idea.
Thank you, Madhu, for that nice little overview. As Madhu mentioned, again, my name is Rashmi. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And we would also like to kind of introduce this other topic of system preservation through transformation. So now this concept was pulled from a book called The New Jim Crow, chapter 1, written by Michelle Alexander. And this entire book covers mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. And this chapter really goes into detail about how the system that Madhu just kind of briefly mentioned about this hierarchical structure of oppression has essentially been preserved throughout history, just in different forms. So way back in the 1700s, it started off with slavery and indentured servitude. And now this particular chapter of the book kind of walks through how that has been preserved just under different names, even through recently with the criminal justice system and the crime bill and all sorts of things like that. So the way we kind of conceptualize this theme is through this graphic that we have here on this slide. And I'm going to walk through all of the little phases by presenting an example that was provided in the book by Michelle Alexander. So in the 1700s, there was an event that happened. It was a rebellious act by the name of Bacon's Rebellion. I'm sure maybe some people have heard of it. It was essentially initiated by Nathaniel Bacon, who was a poor white man who at some point in his I guess, indentured servitude to the planter elite at the time, he had this desire for equal land distribution. So he essentially saw this separation between the white folks at the top of the caste, at the highest caste group, and they were the ones that owned a lot of land, and they were the ones that were able to plant for their own food and whatnot. And so they basically employed indentured servants, who were poor white folks, and slaves to kind of do their work for them. And so Nathaniel Bacon was one of these people, and he was pretty upset that he had to serve these people, and he was kind of over it. And he said, I want to own my own land and be able to do these things for myself. And so when he asked the planter elite if he could have an opportunity to do that, he basically was shut down, and he was obviously very upset about it. And so he saw this shared notion of unequal land distribution, not only amongst himself and his poor white community, but also the Black slaves as well. So he basically formed this along with his all of the other slaves that he knew of and his poor white folks. He brought them together, created this cross-cultural alliance. And so this alliance then came together and was outraged and came up and rebelled against the planter elite, and that became known as Bacon's Rebellion. So in Jamestown, Virginia, they had riots and rebellious acts that kind of were in an attempt to overthrow the planter elite. At this point, the planter elite were not having it, and so they started using tactics like fear-mongering and racial bribery, particularly trying to instill fear into the poor white folks, and they basically kind of portrayed the Black slaves as savages, and they told them, hey, you're becoming like this because these savage folks are kind of pulling you into their ways. You need to disassociate yourself from them. And if you do so, then we're going to provide you with protection and police protection like what we have as a planter elite. And that way you can be saved from this group of people. And so the elitist group started manufacturing the division. So you see at the bottom of the cycle here, that's kind of what we have. And then that notion was then solidified in policy. So whenever they started saying things like, oh, we're going to give you police protection if you disassociate yourself from this group of people, that was also, this racial bribery was kind of solidified in law, which then instilled fear into the alliance, saying that, oh man, if we kind of stay together, we are going to be legally penalized for it. And so that led to this alliance breaking, and then we came back to this, the system was then just going back to the way that it was before this whole event kind of started. So we want you to kind of take this theme with you today as we engage in discussion as we move on. And we're not introducing this theme as a way to excuse the language or actions of people at the top of the caste or of various communities, including our own South Asian community that might have perpetuated the system, but we just wanted to provide a way to conceptualize it. And now with that being said, you should keep me on that slide. I'd like to just introduce today's discussion themes. So the first discussion theme is going to be internalized racism. And after we portray, so the way we're going to talk about these themes today is by presenting to you various types of media, whether that be movies, TV shows, or just kind of like screen grabs from like YouTube videos that we've found, and like mixed media, like articles and whatnot. And then we're going to have quick breakout sessions. So we're going to have a 10-minute breakout session after the first theme, which is going to be internalized racism. Then we're going to go on, we're going to come back, we're going to present to you media relating to colorism, which we will also go over the definitions of all of these things. If you're not familiar with these concepts, please don't worry. And then we're going to go into a breakout session after theme 2. And then we're going to come back into a large group discussion and talk about anti-Blackness in the South Asian identity formation. And that's going to be our biggest chunk of our discussion today. And then to discuss that, we're going to come back into a large group discussion. So that's kind of the rundown. And now I'm going to pass it off to Varsha. I think is going to cover internalized racism. And we're going to go from there.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Varsha. I am okay with any pronouns, they, them is good. I'm also a part of SUB, and I am really glad to be here with all of you today. So yeah, our first sort of theme is internalized racism, which, as you can see, the definition is the acceptance by marginalized racial populations of negative societal beliefs and stereotypes about themselves. So it's sort of this process of like growing up in a place like a predominantly white society like the United States, and not seeing much of yourself at all, much of your identity being represented, and like kind of not knowing how to form your own identity. But when you do sort of see your identity represented, it's like these stereotyped, exaggerated versions of it. So for example, there's like Baljeet from Phineas and Ferb, Kelly Kapoor from The Office, and the other two. So yeah, so this is sort of one of the big things that we have to deal with that sort of also ties into other, like a sort of broader conversation of racism in the United States. Yeah, and a more recent example of internalized racism also kind of being almost directly addressed is from the TV show Never Have I Ever, which, for those of you who have not seen it, it was released last spring. And it was it's by Mindy Kaling, is one of the creators of the show. And it's basically about a like an Indian American girl. It's a coming of age story of an Indian American girl in California, sort of like navigating her social life and trying to come to terms with her identity. So we have a small clip.
Isha? Yeah.
I think there should be an option on your screen that says
Share computer sound.
Computer sound.
Sure. If one of you want to try, is it the sound not showing up for you guys? Yeah.
Hang on. All right, let me try doing this.
It's not a tech event without some technical difficulties.
That's true.
You can kind of go back and.
Okay. Is
Okay,
everyone
I
able
got
to
it.
see this?
Did you do it? Okay.
I'm sharing this screen.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear?
Your screen's not even sharing.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sharing.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to do it.
Okay, good.
Okay. Can you see this? Okay. Okay. So thank you for bearing with us, everyone, with that. Now, Paul, if you could help us go into 4 breakout sessions that will kind of be randomly assigned into. we can pop over and have a small group discussion for about 10 minutes, kind of thinking about these that media clip, and we have some prepared discussion questions to kind of guide our conversation. So if you get an invite to join a breakout room, please accept it. So I think everyone should be back.
Welcome back, everyone.
So we can hand it off to Prachi now to talk about theme 2.
I'm Prachi, she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm based in Pittsburgh right now. So this topic came up actually in my breakout session a little bit, but we're segueing from internalized racism to colorism, and you can argue that colorism is almost a manifestation of internalized racism in some ways, right? So colorism is this concept of discrimination in which people with lighter skin are often given more privileges or viewed more favorably than those with darker skin. And we see this throughout South Asia and South Asian culture, and it manifests in many ways. It's deeply entrenched. One example that we picked out to share is this. Well, to start, in 2019, Beyonce released this song called Brown Skin Girl. And it's kind of focusing on darker skinned women, kind of combating colorism in some ways. And then in 2020, this music video came out of Bollywood called Beyonce Sharma Jayegi, which literally translates to, if you look at the lyrics, looking at you, fair-skinned woman, Beyonce would feel ashamed. And, I was trying to dig into there was a lot of outrage, there was outcry, people were kind of commenting on how, it isn't too great, it's colorist. And the director of the film was trying to defend himself by saying that the term Goriya, which means fair-skinned women, has been used so often in Indian music and media that it didn't even occur to him that it might be a problem to use that term and Beyonce together in a song. So it's just an example of how deeply entrenched this is in our culture. Next slide, Isha. And another example, you may have seen this yourself, is Fair and Lovely, which is a beauty product that's found throughout South Asia and actually even beyond. So this is an image which you might have seen. It's of a woman showing that she's lightening her skin tone by using Fair and Lovely. And this example kind of goes to show how entrenched it also is in terms of the economy and the beauty industry, because it is so commercialized, right, that we're kind of told to lighten our skin tone, to be more desirable, to improve our job prospects. It's just ingrained in our society. So yeah, building off of our internalized racism discussion, we have some colorism questions as well. Just want to go through them really quick. So what does colorism in South Asian communities have to do with Blackness and whiteness? Colorism runs deeper than just judgment based on skin tone. So in your understanding, how does colorism affect people in ways other than surface level judgments? And what do you think we need to change about our messaging and actions in order to empower dark-skinned people? So we're going to go into breakout rooms again and discuss this a little bit more.
And also, I just wanted to jump in with a quick thing about this topic too. I think it's really compelling because in Beyonce's Brown Skin Girl music video, she actually features a South Asian person named Shira Ravindran in traditional garb, and then for a couple months later, for the song to come out directly addressing Beyonce and being directly racist towards her, I think is a really interesting kind of juxtaposition of the way that some people in the community, in Black people, are doing work to really expand the bounds and do that intercultural work and collaboration, and then the painful thing to acknowledge that some people, even within South Asia, are still, having that problem to kind of go back and forth with. So let's pop into our discussion breakout rooms now and then chat about this a bit more. Thank you, everyone. As we're coming back from our breakout rooms, transitioning into one of our last topics as we're talking about today. If we're all back and ready, Isha, whenever you're ready, go for it.
Sure. So this is obviously a huge topic, and in a lot of ways, we're going to be in a larger group discussion here, really going through all of these themes. And so I want to just say, especially for those of us who've been in my breakout room, I know we've had a lot of topics come up, and I'm hoping that in this larger group discussion, we can bring all these things together. So anti-Blackness and South Asian formation. We're speaking here to the many ways in which South Asian communities and in the formation of our identity, we promote anti-Blackness and are not actively anti-racist. And so I'm going to go forward a few slides here for a second and just come back to our slide that we pulled up earlier on system preservation. And we were kind of thinking through the ways in which we see this in our own South Asian communities. And one really major one that came to mind for us was more recently, when we think about the political scene between India and America, and in the last 30 years, we talk about South Asians in general desiring equity with their white peers in America, and cross-cultural alliances formed between immigrants and between people who identified as South Asian. So I'm thinking about people, like large groups of immigrants in the Queens who were from the Caribbean and who were from Bangladesh and from India, Muslim and Hindus, all in one space, working together in recognition of the fact that they were striving for equity. In this case, there have been several movements to destabilize in terms of activist movements to coalesce and gather those groups. And then here at between phase 3 and phase 4, what comes to mind for me is 9/11. And we see this huge terrorist event suddenly shift South Asian identity in a way that caused division, especially between Muslims and non-Muslims. And we saw policies that actively worked to promote that, like the Patriot Act, and actively worked to discriminate against Muslims. And we saw that in some ways backfiring on South Asians. We talk about Sikh individuals who had turbans who were confused for being Muslim. And then we see this alliance break between Hindus and Muslims that really is still existent today in the United States in a lot of ways. We still see a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment amongst Hindus here in America. And then the system is preserved. And so I'm gonna come back here to this slide, and as you can see, that center picture is the Howdy Modi event that took place, which was a large gathering of South Asians and allied supporters, essentially supporting Modi's agenda and Trump's agenda, both of which are obviously have been very anti-Muslim. The other folks here on the screen, some of you might recognize. So the right is Kevin G from Mean Girls. So for those of you who don't remember, Kevin G is this brown character in this movie, and he's often appropriating Black culture. He's rapping, he's being inappropriate all the time. And it's another way in which we've seen a couple of instances where South Asians have been portrayed in media, and it's always appropriating Black culture in a way that's offensive and often problematic. And then on the far left here, we have Dinesh D'Souza. And so for those of you who aren't aware, Dinesh D'Souza is a conservative talking head, a big Trump supporter. And he gave a quote here from one of his interviews that really captures what we've defined on the screen as the model minority myth. So he asked at one point, why can't the African American be more like the Asian? And obviously this is entirely discounting a long history and difference. We'll be providing resources towards the end of our presentation here, which really go into the history of South Asians in America, and the fact that we, of course, came here on the Immigration Bill of 1965, and our history and past is so different. And yet there's this instinct to compare. And so the model minority myth here is, it's a myth which pits people of color against one another and creates a hierarchy, reinforces that hierarchy that we've been talking about before, in which Asian people are represented at the top. And it's often done and propagated by a want or need for being closer to whiteness, which is seen as closer to the top of the hierarchy and wanting to distinguish ourselves from the bottom of the hierarchy, or Blackness. And so it's just another way, a major way in which anti-Blackness manifests in South Asian identity and communities. And then another example, which really bringing this right into the present, is Kamala Harris. So there have been large groups of South Asians who are thrilled, and we're all thrilled, that Kamala Harris is now our vice president, a South Asian woman and a Black woman. And there's been a real push to try to separate out and ignore her Blackness, which is so critical to how she, her role, her identity, and who she is. And yet, it's been a large part of the conversation, especially in South Asia. And so we see that here in this article. It's a young person challenging that. Can South Asians really claim Kamala Auntie sans her Blackness? And she kind of quotes here, when Indians did migrate to America, a lot of people were well educated and upper middle class because of the immigration bill and the history of that. And it created that model minority myth. And in some ways, the owning of Kamala Harris sans her Blackness is another way in which the model minority myth is propagated. And so with that, we really want to open this conversation up. We've talked about these three major themes. We've talked about internalized racism, colorism, and then it really, in a lot of ways, reinforces anti-Blackness in South Asian identity. And so we want to open this conversation up in our remaining time here with thoughts you may have about anti-Blackness, but also colorism and internalized racism. And these are just some questions. I'm gonna read them out loud here, specifically on anti-Blackness. So how does the situation with Kamala Harris fit into this spectrum that we were defining, or that caste system that we described earlier? What are the ways in which that South Asians can support and uplift Black culture without veering towards cultural appropriation? And then the responsibility to end anti-Blackness in South Asian communities is on us. How do we break the existing barriers between South Asians and other people of color? How do we prevent them from being created again? So I'll open this up.
Yeah, yes. Really quickly, Isha, if you want to go to the previous slide for just a second.
We're just going to open up the discussion for like 10 minutes, but we wanted to just make a quick note. This article is not from Washington Post, it's from a different source, which we will distribute later widely if people are interested in reading more about it. But we just wanted to make a note about that. That was our bad. But yes, going back to the discussion slide, we're going to open it up until about 11:53, and then we have a couple of closing remarks before we head out for today. So anyone feel free to jump in.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Imani from Chicago, and I'm coming in late, but I'm just very happy to see the discussion and you know, the points about so before I begin to talk, let me say that I don't typically use the word Black. So when I say African, I mean, I could mean African Americans, because that's specifically what we're talking about right here. But I typically am trying to push the idea of the term African, like in the same way that I don't know anybody's ethnicity specifically here, but in the same way we use Asian, South Asian, and that can mean, you know, wherever, you know, particular places you're from. So I want to push that idea of African, particularly because this, the idea of all of this really stems from this separation that we've had over the last, 400 years about, being African, even what that means in Asia. And, like on a flat plane, until we can see ourselves as African, then we have this issue because we keep having the dichotomy of like Blackness, whiteness, and those are made up terms. And those are made up terms that perpetuates, continuous ideas, colorism. I think that if we can just beautifully call, using Kamala Harris as an example, just say that she is like anybody else, like if it was a European, somebody would just say, oh, she's French and German. Her ancestry is French and German. Kamala Harris is Indian and African. And of course, we know she's an American. Nobody has to say that. No European, you know, if it's what's that? I'm not trying to be rude. I just can't think of the word right now. What is the green holiday? And it's Irish.
St.
Patrick's Day.
Patrick's Day. You know, I live in Chicago. You know, we got a big St. Patrick. I just couldn't think of it. So, you know, when European Americans say they're Irish, they never have to qualify American. You know what I mean? So I think that if we could just push this idea, and so beautifully with our new vice president, you know, she's Indian, she's African Indian. I'm just saying African first because it's an A and it sounds, you know, African Indian. I guess we could say Indian African, whatever, you know what I'm saying? If we can just continue to push this idea, then we can have more discussion, you know, because people do get triggered, you know, when they hear African. So again, that's my idea. I just looked up, I just clicked because my husband said, hurry, you're gonna miss it. And so I'm just so happy to be here. And I also want to say, not that you know me anyway, but I have two little cousins. So the mother is Indian and the father is, you know, ethnically Haitian American. And actually he, you know, ethnically he's Haitian, right? He was actually born in the Congo. That's a whole nother conversation, but culturally his identification is Haitian. And so their children are Indian African, and I'm, you know, since they're only 7 and 5, I'm going to say, or they could be 8 and 6, but I began that conversation very early. And I could see the discomfort, but we're coming around.
Thanks for sharing that. I think you pulled out that theme of separation that we really are really wanting to highlight through that, through the talking through Isabella Wilkerson's book and her concepts. And it just sounds like you have such a beautiful family and such a diverse family. And so I hear you like really wanting to embrace that. And I just think that's wonderful. One of the reasons I think we all, within our group, most of us, I think, grew up in America. Madhu, I think, grew up in India as well. But there's also, I also think it's worth saying that there is a lot of anti-African and anti-Blackness in India as well. So there are people who identify as Black or African in India, and they experience a lot of discrimination as well. And so I think your point is really well taken, that we are speaking to this experience in America, but there is a whole other experience globally that's also being held and that we could speak to. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that was a really beautiful way to tie in that idea of destabilizing and fracturing that spectrum that has been reinscribed for so long, but does not need to be prescribed to have that example. I think what you said was a beautiful way to kind of articulate the need to move away and recenter identity formation that doesn't involve living in that plane on that spectrum. That was awesome. Thank you so much. If anyone else has any thoughts or ideas to kind of bounce off of that in our last few minutes of our discussion here.
Yeah, this is Chandra. I'm Sonia's the other half. Just wanted to share my thought on this. It's beautiful conversation, and it's really very helpful to see this organization and movement, bringing in a wide group of people to have this dialogue. I think this is really beautiful, and to me, this really represents what America is about, which is the idea that people from all over the world, however we started in this country, but over the centuries, we've really accepted people from different backgrounds, initially, of course, from Europe, but then over time, people from all over the world could come, look for a better future for themselves, wherever they came from. So this is really, very a powerful message that we need to, accept, but also continue to make sure we can, pass on the torch for, I sometimes think, what are the countries and what are the cultures people are going to come to this country in future? And are we going to be open to that? Are we going to be accepting of them? How do we make ourselves, our children, and our future generations to be accepting and more open about them. That's a thought I wanted to share. And I do acknowledge and recognize, there are if I look at America, of course, the Native Americans have been here all along, and they were, through their kindness and generosity, they opened their arms in whatever ways that they did to accept people from all over the world. And of course, the African Americans in this country, it was not their choice. And it is, we need to acknowledge that, the rest of us, we all came here out of our own volitions. That's the way I see it,
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was very nice of you to say. And yes, that's exactly what we kind of hope to do. We want to move forward with bringing everyone, and that is the big thing of like bringing everyone from different cultures in to have conversations like these so we can grow into a more inclusive and accepting society. So I know we're running short on time, so we just want to make sure we get through the last couple of things. We're so sorry if, we didn't get to everybody for discussion, but please do feel free, like I mentioned earlier, to continue the conversation with us on our social media, and feel free. We would love to hear more of your thoughts on this. But Isha, if you hit the next slide. We wanted to wrap up today's discussion with going back to the theme that we introduced in the very beginning of system preservation through transformation. So a lot of you brought up a lot of good discussion points, and it's very clear that all of you are here in this space to do the work and are ready to think about how we can incorporate these themes, or really think about how we can actively break these themes of this spectrum in the system as we move forward. So we wanted to leave you with this final thought of, where does everyone think that we are now? And this is, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. And you can just kind of think about this as you leave today's session. But we are in a very unique moment in history. Politics does have a lot to do with it, unfortunately, but we just had a big administration switch this week. We have all these very important conversations, but as we move forward as social justice activists in this space, we've just described to you this identity formation and the implicit biases that come along with it. But now I think it's time to think about, where are we and where are we headed? And this really might just differ based on who you are, what your background is. We had a lot of people come from different places today, which is very beautiful. And your experiences, kind of framing those experiences against the cycle and really actively thinking about how can we break the cycle so it doesn't go to the next step, wherever you are. Our whole idea here is to break the spectrum, break the cycle. So I want to leave you with, where do we go from here? And that is in the hands of the people in the community. So, and with that, we're all here to kind of learn. So in terms of breaking that cycle and not perpetuating the system, we have come up with a couple of action items. So we all can start doing the work ourselves. And Prachi, Varsha, and Madhu are going to go a little bit more in detail about how we can all start doing that work for ourselves.
Hi, everyone. So the first step that we've outlined as, things we can do moving forward is to introspect, right? So we've been thinking at SUB, we've been thinking a lot about our implicit biases and what that means for the work that we do, right? Like, how can we be transparent with our work and our identities? And so we recommend taking an implicit associations test, so you can see where your implicit biases fall. And that's kind of useful because it helps you figure out, how do you navigate your way through the world in ways, like, what are things that you don't even recognize about, your actions. And yeah, it helps to analyze your results without any judgments, kind of use it as information to kind of alert yourself to how you can better navigate through the world. And yeah, continue to reinvent your identity while being mindful of the spectrum that we've been discussing and how we can disrupt this cycle by being aware of it.
Thank you. Rocky, do you want to share the next one?
Oh, I think we're
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There we go.
I just saw a question on the chat about the resource guide. So if someone is able to drop in the link, that would be great.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, our second bullet point is educate. So we did So in our resource guide, we compiled like a few lists that we had found online, crediting like the original authors. So that'll have some like books, articles, podcasts, movies, and TV shows to sort of give you more information. I know in my breakout session, a few people were thinking like, oh, I need to know more about this topic to speak on it. So yeah, these resources hopefully can sort of point you towards that a little bit. And it is a working document, so we don't have like a lot of resources, but we are like working on adding more. And if you do look at the resource guide and you feel like things are missing, you can definitely feel free to reach out to us and let us know if you want to add anything.
Definitely. And then thirdly, which is definitely not an exhaustive list, just like 3 of the main ones that we're thinking about, is to collaborate and to create safe and equitable spaces for yourself and others to continue having these discussions. Like Varsha just mentioned about the resource guide, we want that to be a living, growing document, because we acknowledge that we are not the people who know the most about everything, and no one can claim to be the most knowledgeable about everything, because no one can claim every single experience. And I think using that and using the idea of collaboration and how important that is to bring in different voices and spaces and ideas across various intersectional identities, I think is very important in doing any kind of work. And finding ways to research and finding ways to get involved with existing efforts and drawing from the foundation of resources and community members around you. We are not the first people to do this work, and we're not the last people to continue doing this work. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the work that was done before us by our predecessors, by the people that we're learning from and growing from and drawing from, and also how we can help them and collaborate with them, as well as looking to the future. I also really wanted to stress the idea that community doesn't need to necessarily be an identitarian thing. It's not solely based, just as a South Asian, I don't immediately have to find community with other South Asian people. Community is the idea of, shared experiences, shared passions, in working towards similar things. You can find community in anything. And I think that's one big thing that SUB wants to do, to make spaces for community across various aspects of this caste spectrum, and things that we want to destabilize and shake up to kind of create experiences that are inclusive and positive for all people, that we can do that while we are keeping in mind the histories and the very real lived experiences of the people who may or may not be a part of these communities that we consider ourselves part of. So perfect, thank you, Isha. Going in, a massive, massive thank you to everyone who took the time to share their time and space with us today. We want to continue this effort to collaborate. One of our big things, which you could find on our social media at our Instagram and our Facebook, is our main objectives is to collaborate and do networking with education, outreach, and institutional collaborations. These are things that are building blocks in order to do this work, to kind of network and facilitate conversations and discussions and meaningful work within all of these groups and communities. And to do that, we need everyone to be a part of that conversation, to sit at that table, to look, like we were just talking about, introspectively, to do the educational work, and to do that collaborative work, to kind of think about ways that we can work to recenter anti-racism in our identity formation, regardless of who we are, but specifically South Asian identity formation, because that is what a majority of us may identify as. Yeah, so with our last 15-ish minutes, are we done?
We're done, we're good.
We're done now, yep. All
I
right,
just want to do
yeah.
a quick thank you and shout out to Paul and Rona, who were wonderful, wonderful volunteers helping to facilitate this entire session for us today. And
Yes.
we want to do a huge, huge thank you to the Pittsburgh Racial Justice Summit for giving us this opportunity to speak and to have conversations and create a space and environment for everyone to have this discussion. And of course, we're also very deeply grateful to all of you for showing up and engaging in this conversation with us today.
Definitely.
As you can see, just want to point everyone to the chat box real quick as we kind of file out. Prachi has linked the resource guide in there, and I have also just popped in our Instagram, Facebook, and our email is also southasiansbuildingbridges@gmail.com in case anyone wants to reach us there. We are very, very happy to continue the conversation with any one of you that was in attendance today, or even if you have friends that want to talk to us, I'm very happy to do so. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you have a very, very wonderful rest of the day and enjoy the summit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.